Did you know that Johnny Cash, one of the most iconic voices in American music, once received an award that had absolutely nothing to do with music? Yeah, no Grammy, no Billboard, no record sales or chart-topping hits involved. It was an award given to him not as a singer, but as a human being. And the reason he got it? Because he cared about something most people ignore. Because he stood up for people most of us would rather forget. Because he believed, with every bone in his body, that even prisoners deserve a second chance. Now, let's just pause for a moment and think about that. When you picture Johnny Cash, what comes to mind? Maybe it's that deep, gravelly voice. Maybe it's the all-black outfit, the one he wore like armor. Maybe it's the image of him standing in front of a crowd of inmates inside Folsom Prison, strumming his guitar and singing about life on the edge. He had that rebel energy. The outlaw vibe. The truth-telling soul of someone who'd seen too much, felt too much, and somehow turned it all into music that made you feel something too. But here's the thing. Johnny Cash wasn't just playing a role. He wasn't pretending to be tough or dangerous or broken. He was broken, in some ways, but he never used that as an excuse. Instead, he used it as fuel. Fuel to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Fuel to shine a light in places where society preferred to look away. And nowhere was that more evident than in his fight for prison reform. Now, most people know the story of the Folsom Prison concert. It's legendary. But what they don't know is what happened after that concert. Because that's when the real story begins. See, that day inside Folsom, it changed Johnny. Not just because of the applause. Not because it made for a great live album. It changed him because it opened his eyes. He saw the truth of the prison system. He saw how men were treated. Not as people, but as numbers. As problems to be contained, not lives to be restored. He saw the shame. The loneliness. The silence. And it haunted him. So he didn't just leave Folsom and move on. He kept going back. Not just to Folsom, but to other prisons too. He talked to the inmates. He listened. Really listened. And when you listen long enough, something happens. You start to care. Johnny cared. He saw that a lot of these men weren't monsters. They were just people who made mistakes, sometimes big ones, yes, but they were still people. They had stories. They had regrets. They had dreams. And most of all, they had no one. No one visiting. No one writing. No one on the outside who still believed they were worth anything. But Johnny did. He believed they were worth saving. Not all of them, maybe, but more than society wanted to admit. And that belief lit a fire in him. He started speaking out. He used his fame not just to sell records, but to stir hearts. To challenge laws. To push for change. He didn't come with a fancy law degree. He wasn't part of any political group. He wasn't polished or careful with his words. But he was passionate. And people listened. He met with senators. He had private talks with presidents. He spoke to reporters. He wrote letters and gave interviews and kept showing up in places where nobody expected to see a country star. And then, something incredible happened. In 1972, the United States Senate, yes, the actual Senate, honored Johnny Cash with an award for his work in prison reform. Just let that sink in. A man who once sang about shooting a man in Reno, just to watch him die, was now being praised by the US government for trying to fix a broken system. And the best part? He never bragged about it. He didn't turn it into a tour. He didn't post about it. He didn't even talk about it much. Because to him, this wasn't about credit. It was about conviction. He believed that redemption was possible. Not just as a spiritual idea, but as a policy, as a practice, as a basic human right. And that belief guided everything he did. Now, let's talk about something that makes this even more powerful. Johnny Cash himself had never served a long prison sentence. Yes, he had a troubled past. Yes, he'd been arrested. Yes, he had dark moments. But he wasn't a former inmate. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for people he didn't even know. Because their stories reminded him of what could have happened, if just one thing in his life had gone differently. Maybe it was survivor's guilt. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was just deep, moral clarity. But whatever it was, it moved him. He started funding programs for former inmates. He donated quietly to halfway houses. He even helped create job training opportunities. Not because it looked good. But because it was good. Because it made a difference. And the crazy part? He didn't tell anyone. He didn't put his name on billboards. He didn't film commercials about how charitable he was. He just did the work. And isn't that the most powerful kind of activism? The kind that happens when no one's watching. Because for Johnny Cash, it wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing others. And reminding them they mattered. Now, let's think about this in the context of fame. Because when people get famous, they usually have choices. They can build empires. Launch fashion lines. Write memoirs. Live in gated mansions. Or, they can go back into prisons, sit down with people society has forgotten, and ask, how can I help? Johnny chose the second path. Over and over again. And that's why his story deserves to be told, not just in music documentaries, but in conversations about justice, about humanity, and about what it really means to leave a legacy. Because legacy isn't just what you achieve. It's what you give. Johnny Cash gave his time. His attention. His reputation. His voice. He gave hope to men who had none. He gave dignity to people the world had written off. He reminded them, and us, that no one is beyond redemption. And that belief, it didn't just shape his life. It shaped his art. If you go back and listen to his later music, there's a tenderness there. A sadness. A plea. Not just to be understood, but to understand. He wrote and sang from the perspective of people who felt trapped. Not just in prison cells, but in life. And maybe that's why people connected with him so deeply. Because whether you're in a cell or a cubicle, we all know what it feels like to be stuck. To be judged. To wonder if we can ever make things right. Johnny Cash didn't have all the answers. But he offered something more important, he asked the questions. And when he did, the world listened. So now, maybe we need to listen too. Maybe we need to ask ourselves what we're doing with our own platforms, big or small. Are we using them to lift people up? To tell the truth? To open eyes? To challenge systems that don't work? Because that's what Johnny did. And he didn't have to. He could have kept touring. Kept selling records. Kept living the rock star life. But instead, he walked into the shadows, so that someone else could find their way out. That's courage. That's character. That's Johnny Cash. So the next time you hear someone talk about him like he was just a country singer or an outlaw icon, you can say, he was more. He was a fighter for justice. A friend to the forgotten. A man who turned pain into purpose. And that might just be the greatest thing he ever did. Now I want to ask you something personal. Who inspires you, not for what they do in the spotlight, but for what they do behind the scenes? Who uses their influence to make someone else's life better? Let me know in the comments. Because we need more stories like this. More reminders that the world can be kind, if we choose to make it so. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, or feel, or even cry a little, stick around. There's another video waiting for you. Another reminder that sometimes, the real heroes are the quiet ones. Hit the like button if this story touched your heart. Subscribe if you want more stories that matter. And most of all, thank you, for listening. Because just like Johnny knew, sometimes, listening is the first step to changing everything.